Welcome everyone to our first panel. We're gonna give it just a minute or two to let a few more people come in from the waiting room, and then we will get started.
Are you Miss Matthews?
I am.
Okay, I'm glad that you're on. I'm Judge Donald. I just wanted to know, am I on today or tomorrow? I'm going to be here regardless, but I just wanted to know, am I on today's panel or tomorrow's panel?
You are on. Judge Donald, I am so delighted to meet you. Thank you
It's good.
so much.
It's good to
It's
meet
an
you.
honor to have you here.
Thank you.
You are welcome to be on any of these events you'd like to. But the panel with you and LaTanya Sweeney and Wendy Hall is going to be Monday,
Okay,
March
that's
29th at 2:30 p.m.
perfect. Well, I'm going to cut my mute off and listen. I don't know who all is listening, but let me just tell you how much I thank you for inviting me into the circle to preview the movie. It was amazing, but I'm gonna mute myself and just be here to listen. And I am so grateful that Andrew put us together.
We
Thank you.
are so grateful you are
Thank
here.
you. Okay, I'm gonna mute now.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited that you're here. We've had almost 500 people register for these films and discussions and panels, and in 11 countries at least, and that's just countries I can tell from the emails. The US, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Spain, Italy, the UK, Colombia, Canada, Afghanistan, and Australia. We have folks from Clarkson, SUNY Potsdam, SUNY Canton, St. Lawrence, Plattsburgh, Wisconsin, Purdue, USC, Indiana, Harvard, the Boston Public Library, and local high schools. So we are super excited. I would really like to thank my fellow organizers. A number of them are here, not all of them. Yan Chen, Chris Mahoney, Izzy Grasso, Abigail Matthews, and Esma Wally are here with us tonight. And also I'd like to thank Sarah Treptow, who is the STEM Leaf Project Director at Clarkson, Paul Hyland, who is part of the ACM US Technology Policy Council, and Lorraine Kisselberg, who is a professor at Purdue University and the chair of ACM's Technology Policy Council. Before we get started, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement, and I apologize in advance for any errors I might make. I learned so much from a related land acknowledgement that was offered recently by Philip White Cree, who is a professor of history in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Clarkson. I would like to personally and respectfully acknowledge the wisdom of Indigenous people who have inhabited this land. The Potsdam campus of Clarkson University is located on traditional territory of the Akwesasne Mohawk. And I am grateful to them for their continuing custodianship of the lands and waterways that we inhabit. And I acknowledge that these traditional territories were never wholly surrendered and were only claimed by competing French and British colonial interests and later New York State. And as we gather here virtually at Clarkson, we recognize the contributions of the Akwesasne Mohawk, the Haudenosaunee, and other Indigenous peoples who have made in preserving and protecting the land and waterways, teaching ways of living in thankfulness for the land and in respect for one another. I would also like to mention that in addition to the great films Coded Bias and Picture a Scientist that are officially part of this virtual film series, that earlier this month, Clarkson also offered a virtual screening of the film Without a Whisper, which is a powerful film by Kat Sitsione Fox, who lives in the Mohawk territory of Akwesasne, which is so close to my home in Messina, New York. And it is a really powerful film. that shares the often untold story of the profound influence of Indigenous women on the beginning of the women's rights movement in the US. If you've ever visited the Women's Rights National Historical Park or National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, or the Susan B. Anthony House in Rochester, New York, you may think you know the beginning of the women's rights movement story in the US. But that story, as it's told, often misses how white women who organized these movements that you often learn about actually learned much of their vision from the Indigenous women of the Finger Lakes area of New York, women who play key roles in governance as clan mothers. And there was a wonderful panel of the filmmaker and clan mother Louise Hearn and Dr. Sally Roche Wagner, and it was moderated by the National Affairs Coordinator at SUNY Potsdam. I'd also like to quickly acknowledge Laura Ettinger and Zach Miller, who've made a series of award-winning documentaries and educational videos featuring trailblazing women engineers. Trailblazers in particular is the untold story of 6 women engineers who came into the profession and are, at the tail end of their careers now and have a lot of lessons for us all. I also would like to thank our sponsors, the Association for Computing Machinery's Technology Policy Council, and also the Association for Computing Machinery's Diversity and Inclusion Council. I also would like to acknowledge Clarkson's NSF grant, NSF Advanced Grant, and the sponsorship of the Clarkson Open Source Institute, which many of the folks here on this call are part of, and also the cooperation support of Clarkson's Society of Women Engineers. I would love to point you to an overview of upcoming events. Maybe one of my fellow co-hosts can put our tiny URL, Clarkson Coded Bias, in the chat so everyone's got it, just in case you don't have it. I want to emphasize that Coded Bias is available to watch for free now, and there's a direct link and the password you need and all the details right on the website, but you can also register to get more details of upcoming events. There's another wonderful opportunity to discuss Coded Bias tomorrow at 6, and Wednesday at 6, there's going to be a wonderful event with the Clarkson Open Source Institute. And then Friday, Picture a Scientist virtual screenings will kick off. We think it's very likely that the watch window for Coded Bias will either be extended or reopened to be in conjunction with an amazing ACM distinguished panel that includes the Honorable Bernice Donald, who, if you were here for the very beginning of this session, you know is here with us tonight. She's a federal judge of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Also, the amazing Harvard professor LaTanya Sweeney, who I am honored to be a co-member with on the ACM Technology Policy Council, and Dame Wendy Hall, who is a British computer scientist, a member of the British Royal Society, and chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute. So in this Women's History Month, we are celebrating a lot of wonderful women doing great work in bias in AI, in science, in so many fields. And we are having conversations over the next 2 weeks about things that affect all of our lives in really profound ways. And we're really delighted you are here to join us. So now for the topic of this evening's panel. I am very delighted to be able to offer you a discussion of the exciting research work going on at Clarkson in these areas of bias in artificial intelligence and in automated decision-making. Many of the wonderful folks you're going to hear from tonight are researchers that I have a privilege of working with. And I would say that the theme of our group's work is supporting the rights of individuals in a world of automation. We want to see that automated systems, that AI, support human well-being, healthy societies, and democratic principles. And that is not a given. So with that, I am delighted to let's do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll go around again and talk about our work. I will quickly say I'm Gina Matthews, professor of computer science here at Clarkson.
Hi, I'm Abigail Matthews. I'm a Clarkson alum and a current PhD student at UW-Madison's Computer Science Department.
Hi, I'm Izzy Grasso. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a senior data science major here at Clarkson University and a rising PhD student at the University of Washington School of Information.
Hi, I'm Yan Chen, and I'm currently a senior computer science student at Clarkson.
Is Tom here?
He was here, but maybe something happened with his connection. Why don't we go on? Chris, you go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Chris Mahoney. I'm a junior computer science major here at Clarkson.
Hi, this is Isma Wali. I am second year PhD student in computer science department at Clarkson, and I'm a researcher working with Professor Matthews.
Hi, I'm William Smilik. I'm new to the team. I'm a sophomore here at Clarkson, undergrad.
And I believe Tom just rejoined us. Tom, we were just finishing a round of quick introductions. Would you like to say hi quick?
Sure. My name is Tom Middleton. I'm a master's student at Clarkson in computer science.
Awesome. Thank you.
And hi, my name is Gulshan Madraki. I'm assistant professor of School of Business, Clarkson University.
Perfect. Now we're going to tell you a bit more about the work we do. I already gave you a high level overview, and I'm going to kick it off to these wonderful folks to tell you more details.
So the first project I did with this group was working on comparing software in the criminal justice system, specifically software, the software designed to detect whether or not a DNA sample is in a sample of material found at a crime scene, and asking the question, if you would trust any of these software to make that decision or to give you the right answer, are they going to come up with the same answer? Are they going to disagree? And what does that mean if we trust this as evidence in court?
Hi again. So I also started my first project here. I started working with Gina in 2018, and they were working on this criminal justice software work, auditing the probabilistic genotyping software that Abby just described. And then beyond that, the next sort of thing that I was working on was a collaboration between Gina Matthews and Dr. Nick Record at Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. And with Nick, I had built an ecosystem forecast that used deep learning to forecast shellfish toxicity on Maine's coastline. And so we were using algorithmic accountability principles and looking at the relationship between domain-specific codes of ethics. So the codes of ethics in ecosystem forecasting, and sort of using those complementary codes of to build systems to audit the forecast that I built with Nick. And that was a collaboration here. And more recently, I've worked on the gender bias work, but I think other people are going to talk more about that.
And I think I agreed to give just a teeny overview of the natural language processing work we do, and then other people are going to fill in some of those details. So natural language processing is when you learn from corpora of human text, and it's pretty amazing. You can ingest large corpora of human text, and just ingesting it, you can then play games like, you know, man is to woman as king is to, and the system will say queen. And you're like, that's amazing. You just learned that because you ingested a bunch of Google News. But then you can also say man is to woman as computer programmer is to, and the system might say homemaker. And then you're like, wait a minute, are you going to use that to sort resumes for computer programming jobs? I think we might have a problem. And in addition to that, a lot of NLP that is guiding the future for all of us is based on very few languages. It's mostly based on English, maybe a little Chinese. And there's over 7,000 languages spoken in the world. And not listening to the rest of the world is just not okay. So we study gender bias in NLP and also the underrepresentation of voices in NLP.
So I joined the team last January for my honors thesis, and we decided to do the natural language processing gender bias in languages like including English, Chinese, Arabic, French, Farsi, Wolof, Urdu, a lot of languages, and Spanish. And so for me, I was working on translating and defining set like gender words such as, he, she, men, women. And we decided to get rid of some pairs such as like Mary, John, which in this case, Mary and John are not really names in Chinese. So we are thinking about like, we should get rid of it. And then currently we're thinking about expanding more defining set gender pairs like brothers, sisters, cousins, because in Chinese we have different words for older brother, older sister, younger brother. And in addition to that, we are going to add more professions because like maybe idol is a really popular profession in China, but it's not as popular here. And that definitely has to do with something like to help the result. And yeah, that's basically it.
Hi, so I've been working on some of the profession sets that kind of Yan had started talking about. And we found some things around that, some issues around that with different languages having some languages have gendered languages, so they have male, female, and for the same profession, whether you're male or female, has a different word for it. So it's, we've had some difficulties in kind of comparing languages that have one word for a profession versus languages that have multiple, and even languages are kind of changing over time. So some of that gendered is in the between the professions is reducing. And also, some languages plurals tend to be more male focused versus plural. Like if you're saying like a group of doctors in a language that is gendered, it's typically the male word for that. I've also been starting to look into OCR differences between languages and how that's impacting in the the NLP chain.
I'd love to just quickly say a little bit of context of the defining sets and the profession words that might help people understand a little kind of the way it works. So these NLP systems, some of them, what they do when they ingest things like large corpora of Google News or Wikipedia, is they build the vectors to represent each word. And if you ever remember from math having, three-dimensional vectors, these are like 300-dimensional vectors. And that's hard for humans to think about. But then they make these vectors and then they play these word games. They basically say, what is the relationship to the word vector for man to the word vector for woman? And they say, okay, that's what it looks like to be representing a gender binary. And we know that gender is more complicated than that, but grammatically speaking, often there is, there are some words that you expect to be gendered. But then you look at words like profession words like doctor, nurse, teacher, engineer, where ideally they would not be gendered, but in many cases they are very gendered. For example, nurse is often very female oriented and doctor is very male oriented. And this is just the things that the NLP software learns by ingesting large corpora of human text. Okay. I think next up is Chris. Yes.
Yeah. So I joined the team I think like 7 or 8 months ago now. It's getting closer and closer to a year. My role has been training these models. I've done a few things. My role has been training these models by gathering data from Wikipedia. So I went through all of our multiple languages and cloned the Wikipedia repositories, and then trained word embeddings on them. And then I've also know quite a bit of the math portion of it. So when Gina's explaining like playing these word games, man as to woman, as computer programmers to homemaker, I know how to like I know how to do the math part of that to actually turn really big list of numbers into words and shuffle them around. I can also talk more about the math later if anyone's interested.
So I joined Professor Matthew's team in early spring 2020, and currently we are working on human languages and bias related issues regarding human languages, like the NLP support for every language, like multilingual support every AI system has, and like the bias in text corpora of these human languages. So with the motivation to calculate bias from the text corpora of human languages, as my fellow said, that we started from Wikipedia text corpora for 9 languages. However, we faced certain challenges in the whole process. Like major challenges among them were full NLP support for all the languages. And further, we could not get the accurate results that could give us the actual picture, like presence of bias in certain corpora due to some limitations. Like these limitations include larger portion of Wikipedia is translated from other languages. And further, non-native speakers also participate in writing and editing of the Wikipedia articles, etc. So more importantly, Wikipedia is continuously being evolved by multiple editors and by multiple people. So with this motivation, we decided to develop a corpus of classic writings. Like the thought is to collect writings from all of these 9 languages that are originally written in that language by the native speakers. So we collected those sample writings, which we just named them classic writings from various genres like novel, poetry, drama, etc. So also these writings are collected from various era or timelines, like from ancient to the modern society, that could also be an indicator of evolution of bias in a language over time. Then our first step towards this was to calculate the gender bias in the data sets of these 9 languages, which we called the classic corpora. Further, we will move on to explore the bias and underrepresentation of these human languages with both in dataset as well as algorithms. So this project is in its initial phase. Currently, we have collected almost 20 samples of classic writings from each language, and we are working on collecting more authentic data. But this process is not so smooth. We have been facing some challenges when we talk about the support for the human languages and its text corpora. Like availability of computer processable data was the biggest challenge we have been facing so far. Like some of the languages, very few of the languages have their text in a format that can easily be processed by NLP systems. Others, like unfortunately, don't have this opportunity. So either they are in PDF or in scanned PDF, which is more challenging to convert into the computer processable form that is in the text format. So as performance of conversion in terms of accuracy, software like OCR is also questionable. Like OCR works very well for some languages that already have better support of NLP systems, but it doesn't have that much support or that much accurate results for like we should call underrepresented languages. So there are other challenges we have been facing so far related the OCR and its accuracy related to those languages. So at last, we also aim to collect some of the classic writings that are translated in most languages and then compare these translations in order to calculate the bias in each translation in each language. So this is the work I have been doing so far. Yes, thank you.
I'd love to mention that we looked at 9 languages, and in our team we have speakers of all 9 languages, native speakers of 5, which I think is super cool. And of those languages, Chinese, Spanish, English, Arabic, German, French, Farsi, Urdu, and Wolof, all of those languages are some of the privileged few 300 out of 7,000 that even have a Wikipedia corpora to train on. And it might seem strange, why do they train on Wikipedia? You'd be surprised the amount of NLP research that's done on just Wikipedia. And so of the ones we're looking at are already the rarefied few that have something. But even in that rarefied few that have something, many of the languages have very small corpora or have just problem after problem in their tool support. Really, the languages that have smooth NLP support are basically English, kind of Chinese, and maybe somewhat a few others. Which means that when you ask, who are you listening to in the NLP guided future, you're listening to basically English speakers that produce digital text, which is also just the producing digital text part is very limiting the speakers you're listening to. You're not listening to the classic works of literature in any of these languages. You're listening to people who wrote on Wikipedia. Will, are you up next?
Yeah. So I joined the team more recently, just a few months ago. So I've basically just been working on learning how it all works. What I'm working on now is reproducing our results without one of the word pairs in our defining set.
We found some really interesting things in our results that of the very gendered pairs that we used, one pair, husband and wife, the husband was often female gendered. So, and that occurred in quite a few of the languages, which is an interesting observation about the usage of language. And it might say something about like, how, you already see signs of that, like women are Miss or Mrs. or Ms., right? And men are always Mr. So we don't know all what that means, but we thought, given the fact that husband is often female gendered, that it might be nice to strike that pair from our defining set and rerun some of the numbers. And I'll also mention that Izzy, who spoke about eco forecasting, has really had a huge role in data visualization and statistical analysis in our team, which has been a great asset. Gulshan, are you up next? We're going to switch gears,
Sure.
right?
Yes. So I'm an expert in network optimization and operations research, and I started a research on polarization, and mainly polarization on social media, because social media is a network of the connected users, and these networks is extremely polarized. And one of the reasons for that is because of the algorithm and machine learning behind these social medias, which is the main topic of the code bias. We started, Gina and I started to collaborate on a very interesting topics on how misinformation and disinformation can be, as a result of the polarization, can be analyzed and modeled and quantified on social media. So in the recent publication, we actually collected about 150 distinctive piece of misinformation related to COVID-19 in a very relatively long period of the time. And we analyzed these set of information and data across 3 languages, Farsi, Chinese, and English, and across 3 countries and across different platforms. And interestingly, we found a very interesting difference between the types and nature and the roots of the misinformation on different platforms, in different languages, and even in different countries, which is really cool.
Thanks everyone for that wonderful overview of everything. I enjoyed hearing that, and I even know it already. So thank you for that. Also, we've been posting as we've gone along some links in the chat. If anyone is interested in knowing a little more about any of the little sub projects we talked about, those links there are places to start. And we would love to answer any questions that you might have. I actually would be happy to open it up for a little bit of questions now, but I'll tell you that if you don't have a lot of questions now, that's okay. We're going to do maybe another round of asking all of us to tell a story of research results you're especially proud of, or, kind of stories of working in this team. And then we'll come back for more questions, but I would like to just pause a moment and give everyone a chance to ask questions if they have them now. You're welcome to write them in the chat. We are recording, so if you want to share your video and ask a question, you can, but there's absolutely no pressure to do that. Or to even, you can unmute your microphone and ask your question. But again, no pressure to do that. You can also type it in the chat. Any questions? So Robert asked, what have been the most surprising results thus far? I have a few answers of things that I think are surprising, but I'd love to hear other people talk about what they think are surprising first, if you want to.
Yeah, I can break the ice. So, actually, I don't know how. All right, so in our most recent work, we did we were looking at gender bias in human languages, and one of the shocking results is actually like a negative. So we had a lot of issues calculating gender bias in Chinese, specifically because I think of kind of like not having enough data to do our analysis. So it really it opened me up to like understanding it way more. So basically, like when we did the Chinese data set, we couldn't actually find in the word embedding the difference between like male and female. It was kind of like all mixed up. And Yan and I hopefully soon are working on a project where we can hopefully unmix those up, so we can actually define these are male words, these are female words, and then we can find the bias. But yeah, I think most surprising is not being able to get it to work on Chinese in our most recent paper.
I think it's worth saying that in our recent work, we tried to make a set of defining set pairs that worked for all 9 languages. Obviously, they're translated into those other 9 languages. But if there was a pair that just didn't really work in a language, we would discard it. And we discard it for all the languages. We looked for a set that worked for everything. And I think we got generally very good results in every language except for Chinese and Wolof. And I think Wolof, it's because we didn't have a large enough corpora. And in Chinese, it's because one of the first things that happens, remember I told you there's like 300 dimensions with which people can't think about. They do this thing called principal component analysis, which tries to summarize it in 1 to 3 dimensions. And then because we picked very gendered pairs, we assume that the dominant dimension is going to reflect gender. And it did in most of the languages, but in Chinese, it didn't particularly, which is, we've been trying to do apples to apples comparison as much as possible across 9 languages. But another take is to say, what's the best you can do in Chinese? What's the best you can do in Spanish? What's the best you can do in each language, even if you don't try to make it comparable across? And that's the approach we're trying to take now in Chinese and see what we can find if we go that way. Other surprising results.
I can jump in.
Like-
I don't know if this surprising would be the right word, or I don't know if it's even like more thrilling or something, or exciting, scary. But I worked with both Gina and Gulshan. I have been more recently looking at misinformation and disinformation on social media. And we were throughout December and early January tracking the behavior of members of Congress on both Twitter and Parler, leading right up to January 6th and through until Parler was taken down on January 10th, or Amazon pulled their services. So I think one interesting thing that we saw, and I don't know if it's necessarily surprising, because our data set was really confined to people who had accounts on both platforms. So that's already going to sort of give you, it's not representative of the views of the entirety of Congress, right? The people who are on Parler tend to share views more likely so. But on January 7th, there was a huge dive in activity on both platforms. And so these people who had been really active, contesting the election results and talking about it and active on both platforms, they were pretty quiet on January 7th after the Capitol riots in January 6th. And so it was pretty amazing to be tracking this in real time as it was going through. And I'm sure Gulshan or Gina will have more to add to that, but I found that to be like an insane experience.
I cannot agree more, Izzy. Actually, that was really surprising to me as well. And I want to add one more thing, which shocked me as well, was that in both studies, in both our recent publications, we realized that sometimes censorship could be good or could be horrible thing. So after January 6th catastrophic situation, Twitters start to ban many people on Twitter's account. And also we realized that in the COVID disinformation paper, the amount of the misinformation and disinformation are dramatically less than US and in Farsi and in English. Why? Because Chinese government ban most of social medias, and it's very strict with sharing, controlling people, and that's a scary and surprisingly good or bad, I don't know. So yeah, just want to share this information.
We've really reflected amongst ourselves about how misinformation is running rampant in the US, also in Iran. COVID misinformation in particular, so it's what we were looking at. In many ways, it wasn't running as rampant in China. But here's like a defining question of our age, right? How can we make sure that the voices we need to hold governments to account are not silenced, while at the same time we can control the rampant spread of misinformation? And for what it's worth, for me, I think we need some common sense platform moderation guidelines and regulations that support Western democratic ideals. For example, we have some limits to what you can say in TV and newspapers. Social media platforms are somewhat of a public space. And there's a difference between a right to free speech with your one mouth and body, like take that mouth and body and say what you want, and the right to amplification of what you say with the largest bullhorn you can possibly use, or whatever social media platform you want to use, especially considering that many times people amplify their voices on social media with thousands of bots, including folks out of the US, like Russian trolls and things like that, that are actively attempting to create polarization and tear the fabric of our society apart. So I think when the rest of the world looks at this, they see the Chinese model controlling some of that chaos, and they see the US slipping into chaos. And that really is not the world we want. We need to do better. When we have some thoughts about that. But I would say that kind of realization has been interesting. I don't know, surprising, like you said, I'm not surprising, but profound. Would anyone else like to say something in answer to Robert's question about the most surprising results?
I'll say something quick. One of the most surprising results that I think struck me was from our criminal justice work, where we took this probabilistic genotyping software. We took a number of them from used in different jurisdictions, both within the US and elsewhere in the world. And we ran them on the same data set, the same number of types of samples. And one way we did it was we tried to make them as comparable as possible, because there's a lot of knobs you can turn, and all of them have slightly different types of knobs or different granularities. So we tried to make them as comparable as possible. And even in that way, there were still samples that the different software was disagreeing on, which means that if you're thinking about what these softwares do, they're trying to say whether or not someone's DNA was found at a crime scene. So, or whether or not they're likely to be in the sample found at the crime scene or not. And if you have softwares that's saying, like, some are and some aren't, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, like, what does that say about, I think, often one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that we have in our criminal justice system, which is DNA. Like, we think of that as kind of the gold standard of evidence. And if the software we use to look at that disagrees, then what does that say about
Yeah, I would agree on that. I remember that was my first project on this team. And I was doing so I know Abby and a few others, they were working on really creating these, like, I think the word was harness, right? These automated harnesses to run these samples, and doing a lot of it more like software development. And I was working on some of the statistical and data analysis at the end. And so no matter what they did to try to get the software to act as similar as possible, the results were always statistically significantly different. So it's like we couldn't even get them to act similarly when drastically manipulating these software systems to mimic each other. And this, like Abby was saying, this is sometimes this critical evidence in a criminal case is deciding people's liberty.
And I'd love to say here that we may be used to software improving over time, driven by market forces. But when you're talking about software used in the criminal justice system, the people buying are the deciders, and they have different interests than the people being decided about. And they have different interests than the people developing the software. And people developing software, it's expensive to debug. And, they might say, oh, that's a small problem. We don't really have to fix that, do we? That doesn't affect too many people. But if you're the defendant it affects, then you want it fixed. And you have a right to have it fixed. And many times intellectual property law has been used not to reward excellence like it's supposed to be, but to shield developers from the consequences of their bad behavior, their lack of excellence. And that's not a recipe for the world we want. And I put a link in the chat to a recent court case, New Jersey versus Pickett. There's also been other recent ones in which the tide is starting to turn. And more and more they're saying defendants, should have a right to examine these software systems. Their defense teams, experts for them under protective order, ought to be able to look at these things. Where for many years they were saying, no, it's just the software says so. That's it. You don't get to look inside. You just have to take it at face value. And And given how poorly implemented these are when you go in and take a look, trust me, that's not enough. Not okay.
Yeah, one of the first softwares we looked at in that was actually released completely into the public domain, and like the report on it from a court case was released in the public domain because when experts went in and looked at the software, they found pieces that were bandages over coding mistakes that was dropping data and other things. And one of the first things we did was we took that with and without some of the data dropping functions that were just being used to bandage mistakes that they were doing in their algorithm. And when we tested that software, even on the set of data they used to verify that it was working correctly, neither of the versions got all of those correctly. And they got different ones wrong.
Awesome. Why don't we, I don't know if anyone else has a question, or we could move on to kind of the question I had suggested of, what's some of the results you're most proud of? But I think some of those answers might be similar to what we just said. And I also thought we might tell some fun stories of what it's like to work in this team or what it's like to work on this stuff. I'm open to questions in the chat. I'm open to things that people on the team want to share. And I'm going to dig up one more link to add to the chat, to the paper that Abby was referring to, while we do that.
If we don't get more questions, I hope we do, but right now, Stephen, I think you can unmute if you want. That's right.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. This is really great. But I just had a follow-up question there. I was just really intrigued how easy it is for you as researchers to actually get hold of these tools or the kind of software packages that are specifically designed to be used in the judicial system and things like that. Like, are the software developers, presumably there's both potentially a big financial hurdle, but also are they willing to sell or offer these systems up to people working in academia to actually scrutinize them?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Abby.
That's a great question. And it's actually can be incredibly difficult. I think a lot of software packages. So for example, in the criminal justice software work we were doing, some of the things we were using were fundamentally open source to begin with. One of the packages was released into the public domain by the courts after finding issues with it. But there's even further software packages we would have liked to test, but we were either unable to get licenses, or if we could buy a license, even if we had the money to do so, which they were quite expensive, like we're talking like $10,000 or more, there would be in the licensing, they would explicitly say you're not allowed to publish results from these softwares without written consent from the companies, which makes it really hard for, even if in the procurement phase of the software, even if, the judicial system isn't testing these in advance, it makes it hard for third-party researchers who do have an interest to, compare and test and publish results.
Yesterday, I gave a talk at USC. Can you see my screen right now?
Yep.
And I'd love to share just like a slide or two from that. So we've thought a lot about what we think could help with this situation. And no, it's not easy to get a hold of those executables. And even if you get a hold of them, it's not always easy to publish the results. But we would like to say whenever public money is used, really at all, not just for the criminal justice system, for anything, for software that's going to determine Medicaid benefits. There's been horror stories like Medicaid benefits determinations in Idaho, like the whole book, Automating Inequality, from Virginia Eubanks, just case after case of public software. And, you know, we could have a lot of say in the procurement phase of that. We could say, we require software artifacts like bug reports, internal testing plans, you know, requirement specifications, risk assessments, design documents, source code. And also, even if we don't require them in the procurement phase, like the court case I just mentioned to you, New Jersey versus Pickett, that is asking for those things to be provided to defense experts under protective order. So that's better than nothing, but putting them out there in the procurement phase would be even better. And certainly, why would we ever accept clauses preventing third-party review or publishing of defects found? Like the government shouldn't allow that. They should incentivize aggressive third-party testing and the incentivizing the finding and fixing of problems, and provide access to executables, and also scriptable interfaces. A lot of the work that we did for the papers that we've been talking about, the hard part was taking a GUI program and then saying, we want to run thousands of tests and we don't want to do that by hand. So having to put like a GUI testing like a testing harness around it, when the developers could easily offer a command line scriptable version for running thousands of tests through quickly. And, you know, I would say that anyone who builds software or complex systems of any kind knows that there are bugs. There just are. The question is, are you deploying it into an environment where there is going to be incentives for the iterative process of debugging and improvement? And if you're not, I would say that is irresponsible when you're making really critical decisions about people's lives with public money, or even private decisions in regulated areas like hiring, housing, credit, things like that. Thank you for that question, Stephen. That was great.
In the chat, Heaprock says, I think AI systems have a lot of data, and the problem is basically getting a bunch of data. Trying to get a really good corpus would make the models better. This is definitely true. Like at face level, the more data you have, the better these algorithms can become. But specifically with the gender bias work and the natural language processing, if your data is coming from the past, there has been a lot of gender bias. So unless if you're going to try to like create non-biased data, it's very difficult. And I also wanted to mention this early on, that I, as a junior, like actually between sophomore and junior year, I was able to read the papers and like understand the math required to test. Like I can tell you this word embedding has X or Y gender bias in it. And I think it's really disappointing to me that there are people who aren't doing these tests that are deploying them into the world. Like if a college kid can do it in a couple of weeks, like why can't Google or why can't Amazon run these tests? There are algorithms that exist to minimize the bias, and there's all this, yeah, it's really disappointing. But specifically on getting better data, maybe Gina, you could talk about this. A previous project was actually testing on different corpuses and seeing what gender bias they introduce. So there's how does it work? I think there's like these glue training sets. So you take your model and you train it on like a corpora that's supposed to like teach it how to answer SAT questions, or teach it how to do X, Y, or Z, or like have it understand hate speech on Twitter. And the previous project, we looked at what kind of gender bias each of these corpora individually introduced. And we got some like really shocking results, like the one on hate speech, even though it was really, really hateful content, like some of the worst stuff you can find on the internet. It wasn't particularly, they weren't focused on like gender hate. They were more focused on like race and those kinds of issues. And we found that the Gina, can you tap in here? I forget the name of it. If you
Sure.
wanna, if you could.
Yeah. You know, first, I'd just like to step back and say that you said the exact right thing about using data from the past, and the past being kind of an ugly place. I mean, it's all we have to learn from, so we better learn from it. But to use it as like a perfect oracle of the future, this logical, unbiased decisions made by computer, that's just not true. Training on past data brings in all sorts of patterns of past discrimination and bias and racism, and it's not okay. We need to be looking at the ingredients we're using to build these systems, and also testing the disparate impact of the final systems. And we've been looking a lot at underrepresentation of languages and gender bias in our work. But like the Coded Bias film really highlights the work of folks like Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru, looking at facial recognition systems and how they were built and trained mostly by white men, and they work great for white men, and they are like a coin flick inaccurate for dark-skinned women. That is not okay. You know, that it's just incredibly, you know, heartbreaking to watch this brilliant MIT researcher say that the facial recognition system didn't even recognize her face until she put a white mask on. Like, we can do better. We're just not requiring that we do better.
And I want to say, like, when Gina, when you say we can do better, like, we literally can. Like, the algorithms exist to do better, do exist. Just the companies implementing these processes aren't, I guess they just aren't incentivized to.
There's so many instances in which the deciders or the developers say, oh, this is good enough for me, right? And it's not good enough for all of us. And that is not going to be a recipe for a world that is okay. Yeah.
One more thing I'd like to say about data is that it is proven that, like, there is no way to take all kinds of bias out of data. You cannot create a data set that is completely unbiased in all senses of the meaning. There are fundamentally different definitions of fairness and whatever you, when you look at different dimensions of data, you, unless every person in the world is exactly equal and there's no differences in people, then you can't create a data set that doesn't have differences. It's about deciding on what definition of fairness you want to optimize for. And if you can't optimize for the ones you have, then having methods of accountability and transparency in the systems and recourse for questioning how decisions are made, beyond just writing algorithms based on data.
I would love to jump in there really quickly, because this ties in really closely to the work I actually did with the ecosystem forecasting, which might sound strange, but so we were looking at work from Timnit Gebru, and a research team that she was working with, and they had developed these high-level frameworks for algorithmic accountability, so you could audit your systems for different definitions of fairness. And there was a talk too that was called, I think, 21 Definitions of Fairness in Their Politics. That was really great. I don't remember who gave the talk, but they were talking about how this is a wild goose chase in trying to create the equation for fairness, right? Because there are different competing and conflicting definitions. And so the work that I was doing with Gina and Dr. Nick Record was looking at, okay, so then what is the right answer then? And so what we sort of came up with as an idea was it really should be upholding the values of, or we didn't come up with this idea, but I think the person who gave the talk, 21 Different Definitions of Fairness in Their Politics, was talking about how systems should be upholding the human values of the field in which they're in. And so that's why we wanted to look at both domain-specific codes of ethics, so codes of ethics written by ecosystem forecasters, and in collaboration with these high-level algorithmic accountability frameworks, written by machine learning researchers. So it's really important to, I guess, understand that space, that there's not one definition of fairness, but there are experts in these domains that are, and which machine learning is being applied. And now the decision-making from experts is being shifted to software developers who are not experts in these fields. And so we sort of looked at that relationship, and I think it speaks a little bit to that.
I'm teaching a computing ethics and society course this semester. And in some sense, you can start with like definitions of ethics, but it's interesting how much definitions of ethics can vary in their focus on individual rights, the good of society, the good of the planet and all the species. This is a fundamental thing. And just like Izzy said, when computer scientists think they understand these things and don't bother to realize that people have been debating different definitions of fairness and ethics for all of human history, it's pretty likely that they're going to jump to some bad conclusions. They haven't thought about them as carefully. I think an easier point for departure can be professional codes of ethics. And it's really interesting to look even at, ethics from the Association for Computing Machinery, their code of ethics, or from the IEEE, the ethically aligned design, or look at ethics in journalism or medicine or civil engineering, building bridges and things like that. And you regularly see a recognition of human rights, that you as a professional need to be watching out for individuals and the good of society. What if civil engineers who built bridges like we're allowing software systems to be built right now, or doctors treated patients like we're allowing people to be treated by software systems right now? We know this is not okay, and we need to do better. So we're one other question in the chat had to do with algorithms in the child welfare space. And we had a little conversation there referring, putting a shout out to the excellent book, Automated Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, who looked at housing allocation in LA and a child welfare system, I forget where, and a Medicaid, I think, benefit system. And the child welfare system in particular is an interesting one, because I would say they really did try to have transparency and talk to many stakeholders, but still, it really taught me the importance of actually measuring and watching the impact of the deployed system on real people. You can't miss that piece. But we haven't done any work specifically on child welfare related software. So if there's any other questions from participants, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, does anyone on the team want to tell a story of a research result you're especially proud of, or fun stories of what it's been like to do this work together? I could kick off by saying that in this team, we have a lot of respect for the last minute. If it wasn't for the last minute, many of our papers would not get submitted. We are very regularly submitting something that's due anywhere on Earth some date, which we know perfectly well is 7 a.m. Eastern time. And we'll have been up all night and submitting 10 rapid, let's see if we can get this one more, a little bit better, a little bit better, a little better. Oh, ding the bell, that's it. Out of the pool. We did everything we can. Now can we please go to sleep for the next 2 days? And that has been inspiring to me to see the dedication that all of our team members, bring to that. I think all of us are not just doing this to get a grade or turn in a thesis or whatever. We are really doing it because we feel like we have something really important to say about the future of our world and what we need to do to control software and automated decision making and social media platforms. We need accountability, we need transparency, we need some common sense regulation. We need it yesterday, but tomorrow would be okay. We hope. Anyone else want to add any things they're especially proud of, or stories of working on this stuff?
I had a fun story to share with everyone. It was very interesting to have recorded a little intro for a video intro for these 9 languages, and we have recorded you can see it in the chat. So it was very interesting to have an introduction and video format recording in all of these 9 languages.
So yeah, we call our NLP bias project, we sometimes say, is machine learning speaking my language. And we did a little intro where in the, I think at that time it was 8 languages that we're working in. Maybe it was 9 at that time, I forget. But we went around and we said, my name is Gina, can you understand me? Like I said that in Spanish, and Esma said it in Urdu and Arabic, I believe, right? And that was really a fun. Yan said it in Chinese, and our wonderful collaborator, Mariama Naiji, who was a McNair scholar with us for 2 summers and as an undergraduate, and then went on to get a master's degree in computer science. She did it in French and Wolof. Yeah, super fun.
I will just add that I was laughing as you were talking about the anywhere in the world, because I feel like I have pulled more all-nighters with Gina than I have at like high school sleepovers. And I'm like to the point where now I feel like my husband's a bartender, and sometimes he'll get home at 4 a.m. And so now I'm like, oh, it's 11 p.m. like time to get to work, which is funny. It's just, I don't know. And I think that it's been fun to get to know you, Gina, and everyone over the years since, like I said, I started working with Gina in 2018. And I will say last winter, so February of 2020, we went to New York City for AIES, so AI Ethics and Society. It was a conference, and we had a blast, and Abby was there as well. And I think one of the more memorable things for me was realizing how insane Gina's sleep schedule is. Like I've never in my life experienced this, because it was like right around 3 a.m. I'd hear her moving around, getting food, and then she would work from and I'd get up and go to the bathroom, say hi, and then she'd be working from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. And I was like, who is this person? So it's just funny to get to know each other in that way, because it feels like we're, we're in an Airbnb together, 3 of us shared a room. The other 2 aren't here tonight, but it was just really fun, and it was a way to get to know each other. And we went to a carousel ride together, so I will say those moments of just feeling silly and having fun outside of work have been a blast as well.
Yeah, we also drove down from way upstate New York down to New York City together. That was really fun, I think. Abby, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to give another fun story like that. My first publication with this group was at AIES in 2019, and it was in Hawaii. So I remember we boarded the plane. It was freezing cold. I had my winter coat and clothes with me on the way to the airport, and in the end of January, and we turned up in Hawaii, bright and sunny. And I remember for that trip, I think 4 of us went and again shared an Airbnb, and we went snorkeling on our research trip together, and just it was such a paradox to be somewhere else in the middle of freezing cold winter. Yeah. And for the AIS trip to New York City back in February 2020, I remember Gina and I used to kind of tag team because I was staying up late doing grading for my TA work. And so I'd be headed, out of the kitchen table to go to sleep around like the 3 a.m. time that she would be getting up. So like there's almost always someone working at the kitchen table in the Airbnb. It's just like which one of us was up in the middle of the night.
It might not have come up in anyone's brain, but Abby's my daughter. And I'm going to especially mention that because we have a panel coming up next week, I think next Sunday, so a week from today, that I am just, it's really profoundly important to me. We are calling it The Change I Want for My Daughter and Mother and Mentor and Mentee and Sister and Friend and Colleague. And it's inspired by the opening scene in the film Picture a Scientist, where a woman who's a geologist says, I was in my lab, I was wearing my bunny suit and my goggles. She's obviously a very different kind of scientist than me. I never wear those things. But she said, my 3-year-old daughter came to the lab and she said, Mommy, you're a scientist. I want to be a scientist like you. And the woman said she just started crying. And she told her daughter it was tears of joy, but she said that wasn't the truth. It was because she didn't want her daughter to be treated in science the way she had been treated. And she realized that it inspired her to report some things that had happened to her years before that ended up in a tenured professor at Boston University being fired, because what she said was not only supported by witnesses who saw it at the time in her case, but the same kind of thing that had happened to many other women after that. And we decided, this panel is going to have me and Abby. It's also going to have Patrice Cole and Bria Cole, who are some amazing women at Clarkson. Bria is a rising PhD student at Howard University. Patrice works, and Bria both work in the Chief Inclusion Office. And also it will be Esma, who is here, and also her daughter, who is an undergraduate at Clarkson. And it will also be Izzy and my friend Jen Knack, who's an associate professor at Clarkson. And, Abby and I watched that film together, and it's not like we haven't talked about what it's like to be a woman computer scientist before. But after watching that film, we had so much to say to one another. It really surprised me, the amount of things we had to say. And we decided we had so much stuff to say that we wanted not just to have a panel session, but we wanted to record a conversation of us talking about these issues. And Izzy and I just did a recording like that today. And I would say it was hard. It was emotional labor, but it felt like an honor to be able to do that together. We decided that we shouldn't just tell each other the stories like, it's going to be great, you can do it, you can do anything. We also need to tell each other the stories of, it's hard. And this is what happened. And this is how I dealt with it. And this is the change we need, so this doesn't happen to you. Because we don't want the people we love to be blindsided and feel like it's just them when things happen that happen to a lot of us. So I really hope you will consider joining us for that panel. I believe it will be a very powerful panel. So we're at 7:15 or so. We kind of said to ourselves, we thought this panel might take an hour to an hour and a half. We are, I think, very happy to answer other questions that anyone who's joining us has. And also, folks, if there's panelists, if there's anything that you just reflect a minute, if there's anything that you really would like to say about our work that we haven't had a chance to say yet. Let's just all pause a minute. And think.
Very briefly, if some of the few people left are making software systems that make decisions on people's lives, you should learn how to test them to make sure you're not part of this problem. At least that's what I've taken away from research. that I hope in the future I'll do that. So I think you
Yeah.
should keep your minds open to that. I don't know if you are software people. It might be the case, but it might.
Yeah, if anyone who's joining us is feels inspired to put in the chat, like where you're from, what your discipline is, anything about your interest in these areas, we would, it'd just be fun for us to know a little bit about you, but no pressure to do that. Only if you feel inspired to do so. And please drop us an email. We'd love to hear your response to these films. We'd love to hear other questions. We'd love to continue this conversation. And I am deeply grateful for all of my wonderful colleagues that came together tonight to represent our work. And I'm deeply grateful to all of you who took some time to spend this time with us and think about these issues and how we might be able to work on them together.
Just a quick note, feel free to send us your feedback. How can we improve these panels or, these discussions? We would appreciate any feedbacks. Thank you.
I will add that I think one of the greatest parts about, not the greatest, but a great part about joining this research team has been that I have been surrounded by badass women in computing this whole time at Clarkson. And I don't know if it's appropriate to say when I'm saying it. And it's been awesome. And, like working with Gina and working with Gulshan and not that I don't enjoy working with people about their gender identities, but it's awesome because we are not the majority. So it's cool. It's great. I love that part.
Thanks to folks who are putting a little bit in the chat about themselves. That's fun for us. One completely unrelated thing I'll mention is Happy Spring. It's the first day of spring was just recently. I took this photograph you see in the background of this, do you see that little raindrop about to fall? That photo was April in a calendar, the Fine Arts Up North calendar. Because I love to do some photography when I'm not doing computer science. And in fact, if you come to the Change I Want for My Daughter panel, I'll even read you a poem I wrote. Stay tuned for that. I told you it's totally unrelated. Anybody else have?
Oh,
say again? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was gonna share something that I think is really fun and interesting when I study about the languages. Because when we compute the word counts for each language, I realized Esma and I have conversation about how Urdu is writing from right to left, and sometimes I just need to delete a space, but it's so difficult in Urdu if you don't know how it works. And then you also learn something in German they all use capital letters for many words, and then for Spanish there are two words for the same meaning but different gender. It's just very eye-opening, and I think if I was not involved in this project, I would never know about it. And so that was something that I found really cool.
Yeah, we just submitted a workshop submission to Trustworthy NLP, which is a gathering of computational linguists. We're hoping to make some friends with computational linguists. Back to Izzy's point about computer scientists need to be collaborating with the people who know things well. We've learned a bit about, languages that have gendered nouns and languages that don't. And, as Yan said, we've observed lots of interesting things. Some languages, Chinese isn't the only one, where there's different names for brothers and sisters based on who's older or younger, or, for grandparents, depending on if their maternal side or paternal side. And all of those differences are really cool. And, I'd love to put a little shout out back somewhat to the land acknowledgement we did at the beginning. I read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer over the break. And I really reflected on what's lost when you in many indigenous languages, for example, the plants and trees and animals are referred to like people are, they have different verbs for things that are alive and things that aren't. And it's interesting how just the language that groups people together with animals and plants affects, I think, how you think about the world and what matters and who should have rights and what your ethics should be. And you know, in this time of COVID, there's been a lot of indigenous groups losing their elders and taking some of the last speakers of certain languages. And I don't know, I just, lots to say there, lots to say that I'm not even qualified to say, but I just feel that, yeah. Anyway, anyone else have questions or thoughts or comments or?
Just a quick comment that on your note that today is the first day of spring. I think as Esma and I in many other countries, we are celebrating the first day of spring, and we call it Nowruz. So happy Nowruz to everyone, and these beautiful flowers to you. I think that's a comment from us. I just noticed that Esma also celebrates Nowruz. Happy Nowruz.
I'm so glad
Happy
you mentioned
Nowruz to you
that. That's
too.
awesome. You know, another thing I'll say that was really fun in our team, I think that has just been like, I think we've all really enjoyed the diversity of our team. And, you know, like we were telling some stories of going to AIS in Hawaii and New York City, and with COVID, we're not going anywhere. But one thing we did is we created a Spotify playlist, and we had everyone added like celebration songs in the various languages, you know, that they were excited about. And that was really fun for me too. You know, dance it out a little in different languages.
Yeah, I've also really appreciated not just our diversity in culture and gender, but also our diversity in like other areas. In some of our projects, we have had lawyers and forensic biologists and journalists and, you know, mathematicians, CS people, data scientists, like all sorts of different disciplines represented, and that's been fun too. Gives you a much broader view of the impact that your work is having.
Yeah, this is a great slice of our team, but there's a lot of people who've contributed to our work who are not here, and I send my great thanks to all of you. Okay. If there are no other questions, I'll pause just a minute to see if any of our guests have any last minute questions for in this recording. Please send us other questions anytime. Panelists, any last words? No? Thank you all for coming. I'm going to stop the recording here.